Hello, I'm Maria Titizian, and welcome to Examining the Context, EVN Report's monthly podcast, where we unpack the key themes and developments in Armenia's evolving security landscape. I'm joined by Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, author of EVN Report's Security Briefing series. In his latest briefing, The Hybrid Threat Within and the Washington Accords, the Disinformation Virus, he analyzes how well coordinated disinformation, framed as a misinformation virus, threatens Armenia's societal resilience and security, drawing on both scholarly insight and real world events. His analysis shows how internal and diasporan actors aligned with foreign interests weaponized public trust. So, what does this mean for Armenia's democratic and strategic trajectory, and how can the country strengthen itself against hybrid threats? Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Good to be here, Maria.
In recent years, and we've seen this and experienced it, Armenia has faced hybrid threats on two primary fronts: Azerbaijan's global disinformation campaigns and Russia's more targeted information war here at home. And we Armenians have grown resistant in many ways to Baku's tactics. Moscow's narratives, spread through local proxies and diaspora allies, have been harder to counter. And the backlash to the August 8th Washington Accords shows just how organized and destabilizing these efforts can be. So, we know that disinformation campaigns are not meant to foster healthy public debate, but are strategic tools designed to undermine, you know, societal cohesion, political culture, and whatnot. What makes such hybrid threats uniquely dangerous for Armenia today, Nerses?
So, generally speaking, when we look at what is known as the disinformation virus, these are specifically designed to first confuse society, and this confusion basically creates fertile grounds for the spread of the virus, what are known as the misinformation pathogens. So, we use in the literature, in the scholarship, epidemiological concepts are basically utilized to explain the spread of misinformation because it is a form of virus, right? So the more people that are infected by the misinformation virus, or more of the asymptomatic people that spread the virus unknowingly, right? It allows for its very fast perpetuation. Now, once a misinformation virus spreads, right, we know we have extensive evidence from all the research and scholarship that has been done on the subject matter. Once the virus starts spreading, the secret here is that those who design and spread the misinformation, they utilize a conflict that is basically known as targeting episodic memory. What this means is that the average human being, when they are infected with misinformation, even if they are corrected with the right information after the fact, their memory functions of the first time in which they absorbed information. This produces what's known as a continuous influence effect. So, the objective of disinformation campaigns is to basically instill the false narrative from the start. So when there's debunking and then there's an attempt to basically spread more this misinformation on the debunked truth and all that stuff, the confluence of all of this confusion and the perpetuation of the misinformation on top of the misinformation, it basically allows the initial false claims to become part of the public discourse. So even if something is fully debunked, it becomes a continued influence effect. And this is why misinformation campaigns are qualified as being a form of virus because they spread and they stick around and they are somewhat difficult to completely alleviate. So Armenia has been subjected to this extensively in the domestic domain. As you noted, Azerbaijan's disinformation campaign is designed to basically tarnish Armenia's image externally. And Armenians have developed what known is in the scholarship as herd immunity to Azerbaijani misinformation. So anything that comes out of Baku, the average Armenian, whether in the diaspora or in the Republic of Armenia, is automatically immune to it. But the spread of misinformation domestically through primarily the Russia front, that's a whole different subject of conversation as the security report addresses, because the contours of the misinformation virus are actually designed to disrupt herd immunity. In that context, it creates kind of fallout or the confusion or the intended state of public incoherence, public's inability to grasp developments. It kind of fuses all of that together and creates a mismatch of further confusion.
And it also preys on people's lack of information, right? Obviously. And we're going to,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, and we'll come to that as to why the Armenian populace is oftentimes subjected to this misinformation and then falls for it. At the base of all of it is the fact that they have not been informed of a particular situation, but we'll come to that. Now, in the briefing, you outlined that there are three pro-Russia parties, if you will, that are spreading coordinate disinformation, both domestically in Armenia and across the diaspora. And they're using the same talking points and the same frameworks. And if we track it, we can see it's the same language, the same tone, the same, targeting. Their opposition, you write, is specifically aimed at US led initiatives like the Washington Accords, which they see as strengthening the current government and undermining Russia's influence. And in this way, their Russophilia, you say, rather than the merits of the Accords, drives their hybrid information campaign. I do want you to sort of dissect who those parties are and explain it to us. Let me ask you this question. Is it their Russophilia, or is it the fact that they are in opposition and they want to come to power?
That's a very good question. On matters of national security, on matters that define the broader interest of the country, opposition parties in any context do not need to oppose those things that are apolitical or good for the country. A simple example: most of us in both the diaspora and in the Republic of Armenia had serious reservations and problems with the Sarkisian administration in 2016. It was an illiberal, oppressive regime, and the 2018 Velvet Revolution made it clear that there was expansive public dissent with this regime. Assuming you're a opposition party in 2016 Armenia, and you hear information that Russia has agreed to give Armenia or to sell Armenia or to loan Armenia money for the purchase of the Iskander missile systems. Regardless of your political leaning, this is good for Armenia, right? Because it strengthens the national interest. You could despise Russia all you want, for example. You could despise Sarkeesian all you want, for example. But this is an apolitical development because it strengthens your country, right? So this is one example. The Washington Accords are an apolitical development. The Washington Accords, as we've covered extensively, were designed, right, to give Armenia a lifeline within the impossible security situation that Armenia found itself in. The Washington Accords basically handicapped Aliyev's capacity to do whatever he wants to do, as he has done in the last 5 years, and offer Armenia specific tools and capabilities to enhance its strength and therefore develop more resiliency. Is it a perfect process? Of course not. But when you're in a weak position, or when you're in a position of asymmetry, you're always not going to get what you want. You have to be realistic. And many commentators have been honest about that. Now, we can debate and argue the merits of the Washington Accords, and we should. But debating the merits, debating the facts, but on the other hand, preemptively, without having seen any information, spreading lies, speculation, and untrue claims, this is what we are talking about, right? So when we see how the opposition in Armenia behaved, right, there was no attempt to, for example, to see what the accords entailed. There was no attempt to see what the details were, what the merits were, or what the structure of the August 8th Washington Accords were. What we saw was a well orchestrated attack against the initiative before anything was released. That suggests that it's not simply an opposition opposing a government policy, right? But overarchingly, and even when you look at the debate that was put out there, the argument that was presented by the opposition was that Armenia is abdicating sovereignty to America. Armenia is quote unquote selling Sunni to America. So it was not a criticism on policy. It was framed through the paradigm of the United States versus Russia, and that Armenians are giving away our sovereignty, our country, to the Americans. So, by reducing their narrative from the very outset to an American genesis, they revealed their hand that it was, in essence, a Russophilia paradigm that was driving their opposition to the Washington Accords. It is based on those precepts that I made the point, and the body of evidence is extensive on this, right? There's no, it's an empirical statement that Robert Kocharian, the Armenian Alliance, are a pro-Russia party in Armenia. Robert Kocharian supports a union state with Russia, very much like Belarus. The ARF, which is an ally of Kocharian, supports him in this. It's not a secret. It's an empirical fact that Serge Sarkisian and the Republican Party of Armenia are a pro-Russia party. Now you have three pro-Russia parties that happen to be opposition, right? So aside from being opposition, the contours of their foreign and security policy are defined by a Russia-centric framework. This is why they are qualified as such in the analysis.
Okay, but let me ask you two questions. Why are they pro Russia? Because they see Armenia's salvation, security, resiliency through the lens of Russia being Armenia's protector. That's the first question. The second question is, if the TRIP road was not the Trump road for international peace and prosperity, but the Putin road for international peace and prosperity, would they have raised this issue?
On the first question, it is very clear that they view their whatever chance they think they have of at some point returning to power, it would have to be through the support and assistance of Russia. So in that context, because from the very foundation they were all pro-Russia political factions or groupings, right? And their political legitimacy, whatever there is of it, is hinged on their pro-Russia or ideational foundations. They can't be anything else. So in that context, right, the dichotomy in the dichotomy of Armenian politics, they represent Russian interests in the country, and they define their capacity for potential political power or return to power through an alliance with Russia. Now, the argument that this could possibly that their a support for Russia or their Russophilia is somehow hinged on the logic that Russia could enhance Armenia's resilience or could address Armenia's security concerns. While Armenia was a Russophilial, Russocentric state, part of Russia's dependency structure and of its quote unquote security guarantees for 30 years, it failed, it collapsed, right? So if the pro Russia opposition's argument is that we should maintain the failed Russia paradigm, it's their right to make that argument. But that argument doesn't hold when we've seen developments, and we've talked about this extensively, from the 21 Azerbaijani invasion into Armenia, from the 22 invasion, to the ethnic cleansing that happened under the very eyes of the Russian peacekeeping troops, and the November 9 statement that Russia was supposed to be the guarantor of, so on and so forth. So the evidence is overwhelming that the Russian model failed. So in that context, they can argue what they argue, but Armenian society has rejected that argument. Be that as it may. Uh, to your second question, if this was the Putin route, would the opposition have supported it? Let's be honest, the opposition would actually prefer the November 9 corridor with Russian presence than the Trump route, even though when you compare the two, the Trump route is far more favorable to Armenian sovereignty, economic gain, and agency. But for the opposition, right, a Russian presence means their return to power, whereas an American presence, from their perspective, means Armenian society gets to elect, and they know very well they cannot win in democratic elections. So their lens, their opposition, right, is defined through the perspective that Armenia's current government are agents of the West. That is the perspective that the opposition has. And now you have the most powerful Western country investing in a strategic route that is going to basically address a lot of Armenia's security problems. That increases the political dividends of this government, like them or not, and completely diminishes the capacity of the opposition to bring Russia into the game and utilize the Russian leverage in their attempt to return to power. So there's the confluence of this. But if it was the Putin road, most definitely they would have supported it because for them, it's not simply about that, it's also about returning to power.
You mentioned that the disinformation started before the details of the Washington Accords were revealed, and a lot of us were caught off guard, if you will. I mean, we knew that things were happening. There was a lot of diplomatic back channeling happening. That we knew that the Trump administration was interested in the region, and a lot of information was not shared. And I want to come back to that point that I made at the beginning, that when there's lack of information, it's much easier for the tools of hybrid warfare, disinformation campaigns to take hold and then, take on a life of their own. What could the Armenian government have done to prevent this?
So let me just kind of preface with what you're saying with the point that engaging in a misinformation campaign should not be the norm. Even if you're an opposition group, a neutral member of the opposition, you're not pro Russia, you don't like this government, which is perfectly acceptable in democracy,
Hmm.
your first knee jerk reaction should not be, let me spread misinformation because I don't have enough information from the government, right? So the logic, the postulate that misinformation is the norm in the absence of information, that is not a tenable or justifiable argument. So in that context, right, the government was engaged in secret negotiations, diplomatic negotiations that are highly sensitive. Armenia is not unique to this, right? Information is not released until there are agreements because we have seen in the past how when anything is leaked it could sabotage an entire process, not just in Armenia, in all parts of the world, right? So that there's a model, there's a structure to this. That's why there's a notion of confidentiality, right? That's why there's a notion of national secrets, so on and so forth. So the government was negotiating, right, and was on the final leg of finalizing the terms, the contours of the agreement which would produce the Washington Accords. Instead of the opposition, as I noted, or anyone waiting to see the details before criticizing it, they preempted it. That means, regardless of what information the government put out there, if you are already designing a misinformation campaign, it doesn't matter what the government is going to say. Your objective is to disrupt, right? Is to sabotage and to basically create information instability or confusion. So the opposition or the pro-Russia factor, once you agree to be an agent of hybrid warfare, it doesn't matter what information or correct information is being put out there. You already have developed a game plan that is designed to spread lies and misinformation. And this is why it doesn't matter what the government was going to put out. Never mind the fact that it was not permitted to put out anything because of the terms of the negotiation process. Now, with respect to Armenian society, of course, I think Armenian society actually did exceptionally well in trying to at least take the time to understand what the details of the accords were before falling into the trap of the misinformation virus. Sadly, the misinformation virus was a lot more effective in the diaspora than it was in the Republic of Armenia. Quite honestly, it did not work in the Republic of Armenia, right? And this is why we come to the point that the mechanisms utilized in spreading the misinformation virus was not as effective in Armenia, but was a lot more effective in the diaspora. But to come to your point, okay, even before any information was released on the Washington Accords, you had Vartan Oskanyan going out there and writing basically thing op-eds on extraterritoriality. He was straight lying. There is no fact or information on there. And when the details came out of the Washington Accords, and the fact that whether you like it or not, the terms of the Accords, but the fact that there is no extraterritoriality out there, right? It was very evident that the claim of extraterritoriality is a categorical lie. But that lie was utilized by the domestic opposition, by the diasporan factions, by the ARF, by the ANCA, and they created this rumor cascade where it basically spread out. So the average diasporan Armenian, as you've noted, who is not very well informed, does not have much information, is reading what's being put out there, and they're terrified that an extraterritorial corridor is being enforced in Armenia. But when the details came out and all of that was untrue, right? The average diaspora, and this was a disservice to them because they were misled, they were lied to. Okay. So this is one example of what was happening. Now, interpretation, right, and spreading misinformation are two different things. We have to be very honest about that. And so spreading misinformation is not a form of debate. There is no opposing view when the opposing view is spreading lies, right? Debate is debating on the merits, not creating or falsely claiming things that are disconnected with reality. And I think this was the initial problem that we had. And so, to answer your question, right, from the outset, we saw five general arguments being organized or designed by the opposition and synchronously perpetuated and proliferated in the diaspora by ARF circles that are fully aligned with each other, right? The first argument that we saw spread was spearheaded by Orskanyan on the extraterritoriality. The argument that Armenia is abdicating its sovereignty. This proved to be false. Okay. The second argument was put forward by the Republican Party of Armenia, specifically Serge Sarkisian, who qualified the Washington Accords as a quote unquote act of capitulation. That was the second argument. Okay. Now, of course, they ignored the eventual memorandums of understanding came out. They ignored the investments, the interconnectivity, all that stuff that came out. It doesn't matter. Their argument was these documents are performative and Armenia is forced to capitulate. The third argument, right, was spearheaded by the ARF, where they said there are further territorial concessions hidden in these agreements. Again, more spread of disinformation. And then when they saw that all of the defensive information that were spreading were pretty much being debunked once the Washington Accords came out, they resorted to other strands of misinformation. One, that there was a hidden Turkish hand in the process, and two, that this was going to rupture and destroy relations, Armenia's relations with Iran. Now, of course, both of these were also debunked. But this begs the question, why are we seeing in a 1 week period persistent and well articulated narratives of misinformations and lies synchronously and methodically spread by these three political groups? It's quite evident, right, that it is part of a misinformation design. And this is why we qualify it the way we do in our article, because empirically speaking, right, the arguments that were created by one actor were consistently spread by all three other actors with the same talking points, right, and the same attempts at a rumor cascade.
Yeah, I was going to say it, and you said it yourself, that I think that it really took hold in diasporan circles, the misinformation and disinformation, because they were getting filtered information. They really weren't well aware of what was happening, and I could see that happening. And in Armenia, of course, there are still people not necessarily aligned with these three parties that you're talking about, who have serious concerns and questions about what this really means for Armenia's security. But again, I certainly haven't done a poll or a survey, but just from my own interactions, Nerses, in Armenia, I feel that the overwhelming approach to this is that this may be something good. This, there's this question in people's minds. And we talked about this in your last briefing. I don't want to get into it again, but of course, there was the issue of why weren't the rights of the Artsakh Armenians in these agreements, and why aren't we talking about the POWs? And this was also used by these groups, right, to further push the narrative.
I think these are two separate points, right?
Sure, sure.
Note that in the article, I don't mention any
Mhm,
group or any individual talking about the
mhm.
POWs, talking about Azerbaijani occupation of Armenian territory, talking about whether Armenia is going to pull cases from the International criminal justice system, so on and so forth, because those are not cases of misinformation.
Mm,
Those are legitimate points of argument,
mm,
right? That's why it's not in the article. So if you, for example, say, I have concerns that the issue of the POWs was not addressed on August 8th, that is not misinformation. But claiming that Turkey is secretly going to control the corridor, that is misinformation, right? This is why the article specifically addressed the misinformation that was put out there. Now, as far as the points that you brought up, these are excellent points, and this is where we can have honest and credible debates on the matter, right? And this is where addressing the developments and the logic that is going to basically allow us to address those issues that you point out can be open to debate. So, one question, for example, can be why wasn't the issue of POWs in the August 8 agreements, right? That is a legitimate question. That's not misinformation. Okay. The answer to that is that because August 8th was the initial stage of a normalization process, that it was not a final, a one off state of affairs. The understanding is that this is a beginning point, and from this, you build up to addressing all the other issues, right? So, the issue of POWs, the issue of deoccupying Armenia, the issue of addressing Azerbaijan's destruction of Christian heritage in Artsakh, the issue of the Artsakh refugee population and the ethnic cleansing. You start addressing those. Now, whether you're going to be successful at that or not, you can have this conversation when there's a final agreement. And if none of those issues are addressed, then we could say this agreement, for example, is unsatisfactory, right? That is a healthy debate to have. But that's not the same as saying, for example, Armenia's relations with Iran have been destroyed. We are in danger. That's a lie that's designed to spread panic, right? That's not an alternative or an opposing view. That's not healthy debate. So all the points that are being put out on the issue of the POWs, on the Artsakh refugees, on Christian heritage, on international criminal courts, right, on Azerbaijan's occupation of Armenian territories, these are legitimate points of debate, absolutely. And they are part of the conversation process, right? There's a reason why the issue of the 23 prisoners was brought up in the closed meeting in the Oval Office between the Armenian delegation and President Trump. There's a reason why last week Hikmet Hajiev called Armenia's National Security Secretary Armin Grigorian and told them, we are very upset that you guys are pushing this point in DC. That means they understand it's gaining traction, right? There's a reason why the discussion on deoccupying Armenian territories is deemed to be part of the demarcation delimitation process. And let's see if that's going to be successful. And if so, excellent. And if not, what are we going to do about it? But when you have processes, complex processes that are being addressed, worked on, and simply saying, I did not get everything that I wanted on August 8th, therefore, I'm not only going to reject everything, but I'm going to dabble in conspiracy theories and speculation. That's not healthy debate. That in of itself is not debate. This is the important conversation that we need to have.
right. So you explained sort of the echo chambers, the rumor cascade, how things, your first impression, the first thing you hear sort of stays with you. And it's the human condition, right? I mean, if I think back to my childhood, my first interaction with, for example, a dog is what stays in my head for the rest of my life, regardless of that.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying? So, we are heading into parliamentary elections next year. And we know that the hybrid warfare, misinformation campaigns are going to be, pretty radioactive, for lack of a better word. What does the scholarship say? Is there a silver bullet, if you will? Is there a way that we can counter? When I say we, I mean civil society, those of us who are invested in Armenia's future, security, resilience. We want our country to be as strong as it can be. What can we do to counter these kinds of campaigns?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of recent scholarship on that point. Matter of fact, some scholars out of Cambridge and UK have been at the forefront of developing models, epidemiologically speaking, right? Because they've been using epidemiology and how viruses spread, misinformation viruses spread, how these pathogens take hold, how you have quote unquote incubation periods, which we talk in the article about. And they also suggest mechanisms, right, of basically curtailing the virus or limiting the incubation period, so on and so forth. Okay. But fundamentally, right, at the heart lies the point of how does your society absorb information? How informed is your society? And this shapes the resiliency of your society in developing herd immunity against misinformation, right? So far, right, because Armenian society has been subjected to misinformation for the last 5 years, the average Armenian citizen has a lot more resiliency to misinformation than the average diasporan. Okay. And so this is why misinformation campaigns in Armenia have some effect, but they don't have a destabilizing effect. Okay. We have not seen evidence of that. The question isn't why. The question is, why do you have groups in Armenia that actively engage or agents or instruments of hybrid attacks against their own country? Right. This is what the article sought to address, right? The hybrid threat within. Again, healthy debate is not hybrid threat. Okay. Bringing up legitimate issues isn't a hybrid threat. Posing questions like, what are going to be Armenia's economic dividends from the transit route? Okay. What is jurisdiction going to look like on the transit route? These are legitimate questions to debate, right? But claiming that Armenia has secretly conceded land to X country, that's not a healthy debate. Okay. I could go on for hours, but I think reducing public debate to the level of ignorant speculation and conspiratorial thinking harms Armenian public discourse, masquerading as a connoisseur of healthy discourse, right? To basically perpetuate misinformation is exactly right an act of engaging in traceless manipulation. So we need to diagnose what these are, okay, and then address it. There's also the opposite side, right? Let's say supporters of the government, or you don't have to be a supporter of a government, but you're a supporter of the Washington Accords, and you come out and say anybody who says anything questionable about the Accords is a traitor or an agent of a foreign country. Or how dare you pose a question about what the custom system is going to look like. Or how dare you bring up the issue of the occupation that's going to be addressed. Talking about it makes you an agent of Azerbaijan. Obviously, that would also be ridiculous, right? So we have to be intellectually honest about this, okay? But the main point of the security report of this month was to basically explain how explicit lies, untrue statements were fed down the throat of basically well intentioned diasporans who absorbed it and were so confused and frustrated that they were shocked about the process. Not understanding that in the broader scheme of things, if you look at this in a purely objective lens, this basically Washington Accords gave Armenia instruments that they otherwise would not have had. And so that was the whole contours of what we were talking about. Now, to answer your question, indeed, elections are coming up in 26. Armenia also faced waves of hybrid attacks in 2021. Armenian society has developed a certain level of resiliency. But the three political factions that are qualified in our scholarship as Russian proxies and agents of the Russian hybrid campaign in Armenia, they have problem of credibility in Armenia. So anything that comes out of them within the domestic political discourse, it does not resonate very well with the Armenian public. So in that context, the disinformation threat isn't going to be one of whether it produces instability. The question is the barrage and the scope of it. What kind of a dent is it going to leave on Armenian democracy? Is it going to exhaust citizens and create democracy fatigue? So these are the broader structural questions, right? The misinformation campaign is not going to change the outcome of the 26th election, regardless of what in which way one leans. Okay. But what it's going to do is, would it create more apathy? Right? Would it create more indifference? And once you develop sectors of society that are more apathetic, then they become more fertile grounds for further manipulation and targets a misinformation campaign. That becomes an issue for 2031, 2036. This is the kind of the concerns with respect to misinformation campaigns. So when we look at what happened in the Washington Accords, right, it failed to basically galvanize some kind of a wide public opposition to it. Okay, it failed to destabilize Armenian society. Okay, but what it did do is it created a further rupture between asymptomatic Armenian diasporans and the Republic of Armenia, right? A lot of neutral individuals that don't watch news in Armenia, that don't follow developments in Armenia, and absorb whatever information they absorb about the Republic of Armenia in English from diasporan outlets. These were the ones that were basically fed misinformation, and now they have become more detached from Armenia. So the slightest rupture that I've been able to observe has been in certain diasporan circles and the Republic of Armenia. That's been one of the harms of this misinformation virus. It has not produced anything substantive in Armenia. So, contextually or in comparative terms, let's say, this is kind of what we're looking at. Now, in the 26 elections, the diaspora, for all intents and purposes, I don't want to use the word irrelevant, but they're not going to have a substantive presence. Okay. And so the domestic field, right, the misinformation campaign is not going to be so much designed to change the outcome of the elections, as I noted, but it's going to be designed to sow distrust in the democratic process. It is going to be designed to sow distrust in Armenia's political culture, right? Because if misinformation is deemed a form of public debate, you are already going to lose healthy debate. And this is why it's important to basically preempt, right? To say, no, 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 these are lies. We're not going to talk about it because they're lies. It's not an opposing view, it's a categorical lie. But these are not lies. As uncomfortable or as difficult they may be, they are not lies. So, yes, let's discuss them, right? And so the purpose of drawing the analogy in this podcast is precisely that point, right? Debating the Washington Accords is a necessity. But let's debate on the merits with the examples that we gave and not engage in falsities and fake speculations and conspiracy theories, and then qualify those as opposing views that have credibility and should be subject of debate. They're not. Lies and misinformation cannot be subjects of healthy debate.
Final question. What proactive measures, perhaps in strategic communication or public education, could Armenia establish to inoculate its information space against the future disinformation assaults that we're all expecting?
That's going to take a long time. You're not there yet, right? And we see this is a symptom of developing countries. So Armenia is not a developed democracy. It's not a consolidated democracy. Misinformation is something very new to Armenian public. So in that context, in the digital age, in the barrage of information that's basically flowing, and the fact that it's a democracy, false information spreads much faster in democracies than correct information. This is an empirical fact that the research shows. Okay. You also have the issue of distrust of institutions. This is a Soviet legacy that has persisted. The average Armenian does not fully trust the powers that be. That means conspiratorial thinking is part of the political culture. And this is why the misinformation virus seeks to capitalize on that. Okay. We've talked about this in the past. How do you address it? You look at countries like Finland that have misinformation courses from high school. Okay. My oldest daughter, okay, in her high school class is reading textbooks on how misinformation spreads, how they should basically understand the validity and credibility of the information that is being provided to them on the internet, how to fact check, right? How to absorb correct information. Because as a digital citizen, it is your responsibility not to absorb false information. But for that to succeed, you have to be given a toolkit. So this has to begin at the high school level. Much of Armenian society is either on Facebook or Instagram. Okay, and the brainless absorption of information, right, without taking a critical look at it, is part of this the issue. We also have to accept the fact that, like most traditional societies, Armenia is basically a rumor-bound society. We love spreading rumors, okay? And then when a rumor is debunked, right, we create more rumors, okay, to contradict the debunked truth. It's a coffee drinking, read my coffee cup kind of culture. Okay, Armenia is not unique to this, right? It's a symptom of much of the developing world. So in that context, when you have these cultural characteristics in communication absorption, okay, strategic communication, not only does it become a lot more difficult and complicated, you don't have the institutions yet. Okay, so in that context, we've talked about this before. You need to begin at the high school level. Civil society has to take the lead in informing, educating journalists and the rest of Armenian society in how information is spread and absorbed. And yes, the government also has to do its part in strategic communication, not advancing its policy positions, but presenting the facts to the people and allowing the people to absorb the material. Now, this government, okay, in the past has had conflicting ways of spreading information from the 2020 war, right, all the way to basically developments that we saw in the blockade of the Hakkari Bridge in Artsakh. It was after that we saw the government from that point through the ethnic cleansing and all the way to the current that we've seen them be more consistent in presenting the fact and not trying to basically play with the facts in advancing political goals. And I think they did a very good job with the Washington Accords, where basically they said, here's the published document, here's everything in black and white, here's our explanation. And they were also, I think, very honest when some questions were posed, saying, we don't have the answers yet because we are still working, we're negotiating with the working groups. It's a working process. Okay. That is a much healthier approach than basically saying, for example, the government hasn't done this. I'm being hypothetical. Than basically saying, we've solved all issues. Peace has been achieved, right? Vote for us in 26 because we saved Armenia. All right. You cannot politicize national security. And that is why I think the government has been a lot more honest with the Washington Accords in basically presenting the facts and talking about it. Now, have they been good at debunking the misinformation out there? No, because if they were, I would not need to be writing about it. Okay, let's be honest. But again, it's because you don't have the institutions, the mechanisms, right? You don't have scholars in Armenia that deal with these kinds of things. Okay, this is something that's very new. We don't have the level of expertise. Okay, and that's why for a country like Russia, and we've written about the broader subversion strategy that the Kremlin has developed. That's why for them, Armenia is such an easy target. Okay, because you don't have the institutions to debunk all the stuff that's being thrown out there. So this is, we have to be very honest about it. So in that context, right, to answer your question, you begin at the high school level. Civil society has to do its job, and the government has to be brutally honest in presenting the facts to the people. Okay. Now, once the facts are out there, you want to debate the facts. Well, that's when we go. Okay. But without the facts being out there, what are we debating? We're debating speculation, which is the most concerning of Armenian thinking, right? It's a chronic problem we have. Okay. We speculate, we don't have the facts, we assume facts, and then of course we have a chronic illness as a people. We think opinions are facts, and that basically makes us the perfect targets for misinformation campaigns.
Well, a lot to think about and not be misinformed about. So, thank you, as always, Nerses, for expanding and putting things into a little bit more context for our listeners.
Thank you for having me.